Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Nia Voleri, and I'm the director of the Varley Art Gallery of Markham, and I also have oversight of the Markham Public Art Programme. And in that capacity, it's a great pleasure to welcome you all to temporary programming, session 8 of the International Online Public Art Summit, Becoming Public Art. This exciting 9-week event is being presented by the City of Markham in partnership with Art Plus Public Unlimited. And I open this afternoon's events with a land acknowledgement. We begin today by acknowledging that we walk upon the traditional territories of Indigenous peoples, and we recognize their history, spirituality, culture, and stewardship of the land. We are grateful to all Indigenous groups for their commitment to protect the land and its resources, and we are committed to reconciliation, partnership, and enhanced understanding. So today's event focuses on temporary programming, and that's obviously something that we know quite a bit about at the Varley Art Gallery. Our normal exhibition year has 3 main rotations and up to 7 or 8 individual exhibitions, but obviously inside the gallery. We have done some exterior programming, and of course, we're looking forward very much to the Native Art Department International installation in the Varley Courtyard. It was originally tended to coincide with this summit in the summer of 2020, but is now postponed for 2021. But at the Varley, we are definitely interested in hearing more about opportunities for and perspectives on temporary programming in the context of public art. So now over to the outstanding co-curators of this summit, Markham's Yan Wu and Rebecca Carbon of Art Plus Public Unlimited.
Okay, thanks, Nia, and for opening today's session for us. And just give me a quick second to see if we can bring Rebecca on. Okay. And well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Yan Wu, Public Art Curator for the City of Markham. Thank you all for joining us today, especially everyone returning from previous sessions. Hope you like the program we put together. Can't believe it's already the second last session. It feels like when you're about to hit the finish line in the marathon, exciting and bittersweet at the same time. I would definitely miss these Tuesday afternoons we have spent together. The idea of organizing this summit directly arises from the Markham Public Art Master Plan 2020 to 2024. When we were about to bring the plan forward to the City Council for approval, we tried to strategize on how to raise awareness about the potential impact of the plan, and more importantly, figure out the best practices to implement it. What are the models and how to move forward, especially for an emerging public art program like ours, still in the process of developing infrastructures and procedures. We thought, why not create an occasion to gather all the great working models in one place and study them together. Moreover, we wanted to hear everyone's voice along the production line, from artist to curator, planner to architect, designer to fabricator, creator to administrator, conservator to spectator, and advocator. Public art making is a collective effort that demands highly complex processes and negotiations. So when the council approved our plan, we brought public art consultant Rebecca Carbon on board to design the summit together with us. It has been an absolutely wonderful experience. Thank you, Rebecca, for your knowledge, insight, and passion, and above all, your firm belief in public art. Originally, the summit was supposed to be a 3-day in-person event back in June. Because of the COVID, we changed to an online format. It turned out that we're able to reach a global community. Our sincere gratitude to those who have reached out with encouraging notes and feedback. It feels so good to know there is a community of colleagues out there who care about the same issues. Looking forward to more exchanges and discussions. Hope this summit is just a starting point. Before handing it over to Rebecca to introduce today's session, I would like to say a few thank yous. Thanks to everyone in the City of Markham for making this summit happen, the amazing team at the Varley Art Gallery, and the great support from the team at Corporate Communication IT. And thanks Kate Pettigrew for captioning service. Lastly, but most importantly, Just like artists, without artists, that wouldn't be any public art. I want to thank all the presenters of the summit. Without you making your project happen and sharing them with us, that wouldn't be the Becoming Public Art Summit. Thank you. And now over to my collaborator, Rebecca Carbon.
Thanks, Jan. It's also been such a pleasure to collaborate with you on pulling this program together over the past year as we've hashed out this program, what it is and what it needs to be. Thanks everyone for joining us today from wherever you are. We're thrilled to be sharing today's panel and program with you in our session on temporary programming. Our session today is the 8th in our 9-week summit program. I have similar feelings to Jan's about the bittersweetness of this coming to a close. Over the past 2 months, we've covered a range of topics relevant to contemporary public art practices from a range of perspectives, all built on the premise of examination through case studies and working models. Our final session next week is on digital public art commissioning, a good closing note as we wrap up a fully digital summit. I will paste the registration link into the chat here so you can sign up for our final session or watch recordings of any of our past sessions that take your fancy now and in the future. They will exist at the link that I'll put in the chat once I've stopped talking. A couple of housekeeping notes before I introduce our panelists for the session. We're changing the format for today's session just to keep everyone on their toes. We've started our session a bit earlier to make time for everything we have planned out for you today. So we will have a feature presentation on the Toronto Sculpture Garden by Reena Greer, followed by a question and answer specific to this project with Jane Wilkinson and my dear collaborator, Yan Wu. We'll then do a lightning round of project presentations from Elena Altman at the Bentway, Kari Sonar from Don River Valley Art Program, and Tyrone Bastian from Toronto's Biennial of Art. This portion of the program was going to be moderated by curator Janine Marchessault, whose work I very much admire. However, Janine has had to bow out at the very last minute, so you will have me today as a hopeful understudy in a moderated conversation between these 3 curators of art in the public realm. And of course, following all of this, we will have an audience Q&A. And as always, please use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen to input questions for when we do open up the floor. So different format, delving deep into the particulars of a topic on a very local level. For the first 3 decades of its existence, the Toronto Sculpture Garden was the only platform in the city that offered opportunities for non-permanent public artworks. There have been exceptional one-off temporary programs over the years. And, Janine was actually involved in some of those. But up until the early 2000s, when Weeblosh and Luminato came along, offering additional recurring opportunities for artists and audiences, the Toronto Sculpture Garden stood as the only temporary public art program platform in town. Until around 2015, when the programs curated by our following panelists came onto the scene. And I'm sure if I have the dates wrong, our presenters will correct me, as those are just my recollection. So for the first 35 years, the Toronto Sculpture Garden was the site of innovative contemporary sculptural installations. A small park in the downtown core, it was a public art incubator where more than 100 artists over the years were able to experiment in public space. A whole generation of artists can point to Toronto Sculpture Garden as their first foray into the public realm, and many have gone on to make significant and multiple permanent artworks. The present and future of the Toronto Sculpture Garden, operated through the city's public art office, is evolving as the public art landscape around it shifts. But we're so honored to have Reena Greer today here, 35-year director of the Toronto Sculpture Garden, instrumental in forming its mandate, vision, and structure, as well as running the program for more than 3 decades. And Reena's going to speak to the history and legacy of this absolute gem of a site. As a total tangent, I love the Toronto Sculpture Garden so much, I got married there. So Reena Greer. Reena Greer is an art consultant specializing in integrated art and architecture projects since 1974. Concurrently, as director of the Toronto Sculpture Garden for over 30 years, she organized more than 90 exhibitions showcasing Canadian and international artists. Significant public art projects include Brookfield Place, Calgary, and in Toronto, Bay Adelaide Centre, East Tower, North Tower, West Harbour City 1, 2, and 3, Ripley's Aquarium, Trump Hotel, now the Adelaide Hotel, 85 East Liberty Street, 125 Western Battery Road, and the Metro Toronto Convention Centre. She will be joined by Jane Wilkinson after her presentation. Jane Wilkinson is an art writer, editor, and independent curator. She's currently editor-in-chief of Canada's largest contemporary art publication and has contributed art criticism to a variety of online and print publications, including artist books, catalogs, and gallery publications. She holds an MA in art history and critical theory from the University of British Columbia, and her research blends interests in surveillance culture, environmental politics, and security and representation with a focus on contemporary art and photos-based practices. So without further ado, and before I completely run out of breath, please join me in welcoming to your screen, Reena Greer.
Thanks so much, Rebecca, and thanks to you and Jan for inviting me into the summit. You know, it is quite both nostalgic and invigorating for me to look back on the years that I reigned under the Toronto Sculpture Garden, and to really look back, which is what I'm going to do today. It's at its significance and its relevance. And I must thank Jane too for carrying the torch and keeping its memory alive. I'm going to start the presentation now. So I'll share screen here. Let's try this one. There we go. And to some of you, it may seem odd to be looking back now at what began in this little pocket park 40 years ago, honestly, 40 years ago. But the Sculpture Garden was a trailblazer, and it really affected what we see in the public realm today. In the abundance of the percent for art works that are commissioned and for the development of the artists that were nurtured to fulfill that need. Rebecca said something in one of these earlier sessions that I want to recall. She said, public art is the most human element of the built city, and it's clearly here to stay in one form or another as part of our urban experience. And so I'm going to show you, just to keep this going, what the Sculpture Garden looked like in its final iteration, just for some of you that may not have been on the site or seen it recently. This is after 2 transformations from the original design, and I'll talk to you about how that happened. But each iteration actually influenced the way artists responded to the site. Before we begin, first a bit of background. If you recall, in 1981, when we had our first exhibition, there was really no sustained culture here for contemporary art. We had mostly commemorative artworks of, say, a particular person or place or event, and they were always shown on pedestals. So it was natural and sort of understandable when the city's then civic design division created this park, designed this park, they decided to have a meandering walkway that would go around a central area here that was all planted with mature trees. And the walkway went literally this way and this way and this way. And it consisted of steps. And on a variety of steps, there would be, you know, the pedestal for the artwork. So until I got involved, that was the site, but we were able to, I was able to significantly influence it so that at least the trees and the steps and the walkway were gone. Fortunately, in the few years in the 60s and 70s that preceded our opening there was a lot of movement worldwide and internationally about site specificity. And we had earthworks like Michael Heiser and from Walter de Maria and Robert Smithson and Robert Morris and Nancy Holt, who were making work that were totally different than what anyone had seen before, and they were of the land and of the site. And even locally here in 1967, we had that landmark exhibition in Hyde Park that included 2 Marc de Souvreau works, and it coincided with Expo 67, and there was this big interest in public art, or in art in public spaces. And I just say coincidentally that the 2 Marc de Souvreaus, which lay fallow for years, one of them was resurrected by Rebecca Carbon for a location in on the waterfront, and Karen Mills relocated the other one in Concord Adix City Place. So they still exist in our landscape. So the stars aligned in Toronto for our venture because a businessman named Louis Odette, who had a great passion for sculpture, he had a dream that began in 1974 to create a sculpture garden so he could make other people as excited as he was about sculpture. And so in 1979, he established the L.L. Odette Foundation as the private component in what became this unique partnership with the City of Toronto when City Council approved the terms of reference on December 5th, 1979. So the Sculpture Garden initiated, as Rebecca said, and elevated the conversation about contemporary art because our exhibitions were really a catalyst for a dialogue between the artist and the public. We had long-running 6-month exhibitions, and we had posted didactic information about the artist and the work that was really comprehensible. And we had, at both entrances, here and here, you can see the artist statement and bio about the work. So at either entrance, you could read the signs. And the conversation, I think, was really meaningful because some of the questions that are always asked by artists and arts professionals and arts institutions are, how do we make the arts matter to a broad public? I mean, how do we reach them? How do we elevate that role in our community? And to make sure that the arts are a signifier and not a superfluous appendage. I mean, we're trying all the time to reach a new public. So the brilliance of the Sculpture Garden was that it was temporarily permanent, which means it required dedicated funding, a dedicated staff, and potentially a dedicated site. Now, just to tell you, I'm a big fan of temporary projects as they, respond to the times. But I'm really adamant that funding for such projects shouldn't come from Section 37, which is derived from developers that have exceeded density to build something that's permanent. So Section 37 money should be dedicated to the Percent for Art program for public artwork that permanently impacts the public realm. Money for temporary projects needs to have other sources of funding, according to moi. So we're talking about the Sculpture Garden now, about 40 years after it's opened, because artists have always, although artists have always been able to talk about their ideas and express things that were current to them, what they didn't have was experience working with site and experience working with architectural scale and experience working with materials that would withstand being touched by both the climate and the public. And so by default, we actually became a trailblazer. Artists kind of were working in their studio and used to that scale, and they often produced work that disappeared within outdoor environments. And that's really not to say that they had to be huge. It just means they had to be sited in a way that took the parameters of the space into consideration. And really, what better place to learn these skills than the Sculpture Garden? So, for most of the value to the artist, you've got this unique testing ground for experimenting with public space. And it was the first time that they got a chance to deal with the hand that was dealt them. That's a key component of most public art commissions. You're given a space, you're given a site that really you can't change. So how do you confront architectural scale and weather conditions? How do you confront the question of vandalism? How do you respond to the requirements of public safety? And also they were given the opportunity to learn contingency planning, because to learn to come prepared to the site and not waste time having to run to the hardware store to find a missing component. I quite remember Kim and Di from Fast Worms, who 6 weeks prior to our opening stopped riding their bikes in case one of them got into an accident and couldn't fulfill their obligations to the exhibition. So I will tell you that many people developed extensive public art practices as a result of having exhibited first in the Sculpture Garden. People like John McEwen and Susan Schell and Mark Gomes and Stephen Cruz and Jennifer Marmon and Daniel Borens and James Carl and Dean Drever and Tanya Clark and Instant Coffee and Fast Worms and Carlos Sesta and Judith Schwartz, and the list goes on. And it's by, you know, we had actually over 100 artists. So there's a lot of good that these people did for the community. I just want to show you the site. But before I do, actually, I will make one more reference to its value to the public, because we had these 6-month exhibition schedules, and the Sculpture Garden was passed by either by design or accidentally by people who were non-arts viewing audience. You know, people on the King streetcar going back and forth to work, or in and out of the cathedral on Sundays, or on their way to the market. And so they saw it in all conditions, day and night, in the rain and the snow, and they watched an artist struggle for 2 weeks to do the installation. So it sort of humanized it. And there was also a chance during these 2 weeks of installation that the artist was open to answering any kind of questions that anybody had who was wandering through the site. So it really humanized it. And even if they didn't like the end product, they appreciated the care and effort that went into it. And invariably, somebody would always come up to me once during the 6-month period of the exhibition and say, you know, I've seen a whole lot of them, but this one's my favorite. So that was really nice to see that we were reaching different people. And to the city, the value to the city, well, it was a cultural asset. You know, what it was used to promote tourism and promote the city in itself, and it served as a model across the country. So here's the Sculpture Garden. Here we are looking at it from King Street, looking south. So the streetcar ran this way. You've got the Georgian buildings here. This is our east elevation with a constructed waterfall and a flower bed. And the west elevation had the balcony from the restaurant. There was a restaurant in here that had an outdoor patio. And here's the plan. So you've got the walkway going from King Street to Market Square development with the restaurant on the right and the waterfall on the left. Originally, in the first configuration, and this is a later drawing, the first configuration had radiating steps that would accommodate the slope from the walkway to the waterfall, which was a little less than 18 inches, but significant at the beginning. And when we started, we had limestone fines over the entire floor, which hid. There were 3, one here, which you will see in a photograph later, one here and one here, flat concrete foundations upon which the pedestal was supposed to be placed. And the limestone fines covered them up. But they also were really dirty and crunchy gravel underneath, and it really was not something we kept for more than 2 years. We did have open calls 3 times a year, and we had a volunteer art advisory board that was made up of curators and architects and collectors and academics and people heading major cultural institutions, as well as artists, both who had exhibited in the garden and those who had not. Occasionally, artists who had exhibited were invited back. And the interesting thing was, since we weren't a commercial gallery, which generally has one aesthetic governing most of their stable, our only criteria was excellence. Hence, its appeal to a broad audience over time. And since it wasn't a contest, if there was no compelling work, we didn't choose anything. I mean, generally we only planned 1 or 2 exhibitions ahead, but several times an additional 1 or 2 were chosen down the line because we really paid attention to the curatorial flow of the exhibitions, with variety being our only guide. So I'm going to, it's very difficult to break down, over 40 exhibitions in any kind of meaningful way. So what I'm going to show you covers these exhibitions in over 35 years, over 100 artists. So apologies in advance for those artists that I actually don't get to talk about, but I've grouped them in ways that were relevant beyond the obvious. So the work shown is not sequential to the overall programming, but it is chronological within each category. So the first one is early site years, the evolution of the design, as you will see. So here's the radiating steps, and here's one of the pedestals. As you can see, this is King Street over here with the cathedral, and you have works by Robert Bowers and John McEwen and Mark Gomes and Elizabeth Frink and John Ivor Smith. This actually is a pedestal from opening day, so not an artwork. But here's one of the pedestals with the uplights and the limestone finds. And we had a group exhibition because it was Odette's belief that he wanted to have something for everybody, something to spark everybody's interest. And we were borrowing from the art bank, from collectors, from artists, but we needed work that was available for a 6-month period, that was suitable for public safety, that had enough materiality to withstand the climate and so forth. And although it satisfied Bud Odette's desire for inclusivity, it really was not curatorially very satisfying. So our second show was also a group show, but the third show was a solo show of one artist, Lou Stokes, with existing work, but one new work commissioned for the site. But by the fourth show, which was Lee Paquette, you see we had sodded, because this was 1983. So we had sodded, and we had a thematic show called, in this case, Recess by Lee, that was a whole site installation. And what he did was he staged a time out for us. This recess was a place for a colorful playground, that these familiar objects were metaphors for confronting the issues in our daily life. So he's got 54 rabbits here, all spaced along the walkway, which alluded to regeneration in life. And in the corner here, there was a big rabbit reminiscent of fairy tales and things you tell kids. Again, a big symbol of regeneration in life, and you've got a hopscotch, and you had a teeter-totter, which is not shown here, and a tree that was about to bud. But the big keystone of the central image force of the exhibition was the seed room. And this is the inside of the seed room, because I realize it's dark over there, with these maple seed cutouts. And it was really a place to rejuvenate, to rest, and to come out, face the world. And then we had Andreas Gehr in 1985, 2 years later, who did this spectacular 800-hour build on site called The Found Foundation. 55 feet long, 16 feet high. It was sitting on the site like really a child's drawing without perspective. You had this 2D rendering of a 3D object, and it was anchored on these uneven foundations. So it was really kind of an interesting way of grabbing hold of the site. This form telegraphs both, assault and protection, intimidation and comfort, depending on how you approach it. Whether it's open at one end or a fortress. And his interior was dark intentionally because he wanted to separate you from the natural environment and form this place for shelter or retreat or for hiding. So we have engaging architectural and landscape parameters. How did we use what was given? Susan Schell in 1988 decided to address the waterfall with a piece called Literalists of the Imagination, which was in fact inscribed here on this bench. And she's taken an image of a 16th century fountain that was screened onto plexiglass. So you've got this real attempt to replicate the real, because we all know these fountains existed, and calls attention to the irony and absurdity of the placement within this man-made waterfall, this display of water for water's sake. And it was actually part of a group show with Mark Gomes, who did a totemic tribute to Margaret Lawrence by stacking her writing table in a totemic form. Then we had Brian Scott in 1991 with a work called Stray Plow. Very energetic work that actually churned up the whole site. It disrupted the domesticated nature of the site and questioned its purpose, but also invited you to participate, mentally, getting in that boat, playing in the water or waves, floating among the clouds, suspended between earth and sky, whatever worked for you. And he used the strategy of displacement to plow through the conventional hierarchy of the order of things. And I'm delighted to say that this work was purchased by the McDonald Stewart Art Center at the University of Guelph. In 2007, Ludwika Orgozalek created this work called Nist, which literally hovers around the garden space, over it, being attached to the trees and the buildings that framed the site. And it was situated in such a way so that when you stood under it, tall people anyway, could almost touch it, but they would look through it to the city and see fresh takes on the city. So she was really exploring space by drawing with line. And it was quite an exciting experience to see the space with nothing on the ground and just hovering. In 2009, Dean Drever brought us bear hunt. So the bears came to hunt in our garden. They fed, and now they're going home. So it's a close range encounter with the spirit of this Kodiak bear, and we've got these 4 massive orange bears in various stages of disappearance. They're going from one world to another, and we have a last glimpse as they're leaving. So we have this sense that they're existing simultaneously in 2 realms, the one we know, the one we don't know, and can only dream about. Meanwhile, this one fully intact bear rounds out the pack, and it kind of plods towards us, just as a sort of fluorescent orange reminder, calling us to attention and visually disturbing, what we commonly understand of what's natural and what's real. So referencing place and context. So we have Stephen Cruz in 1993 with something called A Winter Piece. He was celebrating the City of Toronto's 200th birthday. And he used the specificity of locale to really reference its climate and its history. And that's what shaped this installation. So we know that Toronto is subject to fierce winters. Hello, did you see outside today? So he prepared the ground for winter. He then bundled up all the trees and baffled the earth with mulch and wood chips. And you can see it here and here. And he left the main stage, the grassy area, totally empty, primed for snowfall, to let nature be the main attraction and work its magic. So the heraldic GNR, which is located here on the waterfall, was carved, copper-leafed, and refers to the site's history when King George III, who was George Rex, reigned during the period of the transformation of the town of York, and King Street was an armature of that old town. So the abstraction of the Roman numeral 3 into the Chinese character for river really references the nature of the waterfall and more recent immigration patterns. And the 6 carved copper-leafed domestic animals atop the 6 brick piers are a way of just introducing something organic and living into this artificial world of the sculpture garden. So you've got plants and animals coming together, waiting for spring. Tanya Clark in 1995 gave us At This Point, which was a faithful reproduction of Gibraltar Point's lighthouse, 1/7 scale here, and the buoy is at a 1/3 scale. And it was scaled so that when you entered from King Street, they looked proportional. But as soon as you began to walk towards the lighthouse and its viewing window, you realized that it was a fiction. The distance disappears. So the lighthouse beckons, and when you look inside, what do you see? You see this riverbed with shallow, rippling water over a cluster of stones. And this referenced the river that ran past the site in 1827. So you've got the sound of the waterfall mixed with this virtual of the rushing water to give you, experience that's both, sensual and meditative. And don't forget, you're the only one. It's only a one-person viewing experience. So if you know Tanya's work, you know that she's long been interested in authenticity, and here she plays with reality and asking us to question what the reality of what we've just both experienced. In 2010, we had a period that we had to do some repairs in the garden. And so it was closed for April, and we asked Josh Thorpe and David Court to do a work for us called Reading the Garden. And if you know Josh and David, they had done a couple of similar research projects for Convenience Gallery and for Art Metropole, where they looked at the built environment and its material qualities and its histories and how it functioned and its relationship and whatever conventions were around that particular site. So what they did for the sculpture garden is they spent a lot of time observing the site and seeing how it was used, and they talked to architects and planners and artists and critics and people in the nearby area, and they talked to Bud Odette and to myself, and what they produced was a broadsheet called The Garden, which was housed in these boxes, one at either end, and was free for the taking. And it was a fascinating document about a particular moment in time, and I, for one, am quite grateful that it was written. For our 30th anniversary and what was our final show during the Bud Odette reign, was a work by Jed Lynn called Gold, Silver, and Lead. And it's a 20-foot high totem pole that uses the 1979 Honda Civic as its subject matter. And why the car? Initially, this site in 1893 was the site of a Georgian building called Oak Hall, which the city razed in 1938 and made it a parking lot for 22 cars. So when 1979 happened to be a seminal year when the Honda Civic came out, which was Japan's answer to the luxury cars in the US. And it was an economy car that was relevant because at that time there was that OPEC crisis going on, if you remember, and there was a lot of restraint around gas and oil. And so 1979 was also the seminal year that the Toronto Sculpture Garden was created by the order of City Council. So he went back to the original use of the secondary use of the site as a parking lot, and decided to take this work, the car, the Honda Civic, and abstract it in these 7 iterations. He reduced it to its essentials, and there's no wheels and there's no front fenders and so forth. And lit at night, it sort of functions as a beacon signaling aspiration. And because of the timing, it was actually up for 2 years. So we also extended beyond the site, using the site as a starting point, but reaching out to other areas in the city. This was an interesting work by Gilbert Boyer in 1992 called I Looked for Sarah Everywhere. It's really a mystery story about intimate spaces and moments in city life. And it's a personal story about somebody moving through the absence of somebody else. You've got these 6 granite slabs here that had floor plans and a text, and it showed Sarah's apartment, her place of work, the park she used to frequent, the gallery she often visits, and so forth. The work is really rooted in a desire for intimacy in a public space, because public spaces are often intimate and blank, and he wanted to make this pregnant with meaning. We also had Maura Doyle's erratic, there's a new boulder in town, she titled it, in 2004. Quite ironic because there's nothing new about this boulder, which obviously is an evidence of the last receding ice sheet. But by putting this very standard bronze plaque, this commemorative plaque on its side, you would think it's maybe a typical park monument, but because of the fact that it is on its side and where it is on its site, it kind of suggests that it was somehow arrived here naturally. So she was looking at the ambiguity of what constitutes cultural and natural history. And what she did was she posted on this site, and it was available as a takeaway to everybody. She created a map called Toronto's Erratic Boulders Downtown Map as a guide both to this boulder and to other notable erratics around Toronto, and speculated on their history and their age and their movement. And she also produced a limited edition book that was available as a keepsake. We went even further with Randall Anderson's primary prototypes in 2010. 3 primary colored sculptural elements on a white trailer anchored on the site. They look like minimalist sculpture or architecture or parts of a kid's puzzle or something digital. And the interesting about this was at least once a month he would come from Montreal and taking one or more of these trailers, he hitched them to a car, a white car, and drove them to other places, to other cultural venues where events were taking place. And he had printed up colored postcards of the work and of the intent of the work, and he talked to people on the streets and exhibited his work. And he saw all of it, both whatever was here in the garden, plus the transportation, plus the talking to people, as a summary of what the work was. So, updating the singular object, bye-bye pedestal. In the year 2000, Peter Boyer gave us this stunning work called Flower, which was 27 feet high, made of 4 galvanized globes that hovered in the sky. And he was really referencing the stylized lampposts and flowers in the nearby St. James Park across the street. Now it's non-functional, but beauty is necessary for life. And it's kind of a punctuation mark for the free space around it. But it also had a dual meaning because these 4 orbs were kind of like wrecking balls, and they threatened to drop at any point. And this was particularly relevant because at the time that Peter was making this work, his studio space was being was being reclaimed by a developer and was going to be torn down for a new build. And what's lovely about this work is that you can still see it. It was purchased by a condominium on Adelaide Street East, and it's there to this day. For our 20th anniversary, Micah Lexier made this stunning and unique work all about process and the passage of time. It was called The End and the Beginning. And he wanted to give us something where it was a work where in the making was the subject of the work, and the resulting object was not only a sculpture in its own right, but also a document of its construction. And since it was commissioned for our 20th anniversary, it was also a tribute to time passed on the site. And for me, I was thrilled to do this work because it's the only known artwork, certainly of its time in 2001, that was known that when it transformed over time, rather than diminishing, it actually augmented. So what started out was 420 bricks placed on the site. And then over a series of 15 weeks, 420 additional bricks were added each week until it grew to 33 feet long and 6,300 bricks. What he wanted people to notice was that there was change happening and that they would come back more than once so that they could monitor the evolution of the work. And what happened after the 15 weeks, when it was totally built up into this 33-foot form, was that we used red mortar to inscribe the various components that went together to bring this work into this form. And so it was like a jigsaw puzzle explained. This work by Ewan MacDonald in 2004 called The Tower actually replicates in full scale the full 25 feet. Oh, I'm back. I've only got 5 minutes. Oh my God.
Yeah, I think just a quick wrapping up and yeah.
Okay, so we've got Ewan MacDonald in 2005, and we've got Derek Sullivan, who came afterwards with something called Kiosk, where he commissioned 5 artists to put posters on this Parisian 19th century kiosk form so that they would know that there were people coming into the site that were to look at what artists were producing. We had Katie Bethune Lehman's Mushroom Studio, which was this fungus that actually functioned as a studio space, and she was there from time to time, and we actually kept it up for a whole year. And she was really interested in making a space, an artist studio space that fit into the fabric of the streetscape in a normal way. It was just part of everyday life. An artist was as much a part of life as all the commerce around it. Public engagement. Okay, James Carl in 1997 gave us Fountain, which was this glorious 40-foot long backlit panorama of Niagara Falls. And if you put in a loonie and press the button, you got a limited edition of James Carl water. So it was a real participatory work. It's artificial construct talked about the artificiality of the garden, but also about commerce, because we know that Niagara Falls, actually, the water is regulated as much as our water here in the sculpture garden is regulated. They turn it on when they want tourists. Millie Chen and Warren Quigley gave us Green Room, which was blurred the line between public and private spaces, and they developed a line of designer greens that were typical of the greens that were in the they used the variety of the greens found in the sculpture garden to create this palette for the furniture. And people sat in it and brought their lunch, and it really became a participatory space. We then had Charles Goldman do Infinitely Intersecting Orbits, which was this interactive work, as you could see, where they created paired orbits that looked like infinity, invisible infinity signs. And they were modified so that they would spin effortly, the ropes, and there was no winning. But he wanted you to know that failure, it was fun to try to try, and that failure was part of life. Then we had Louis Jacobs' seminal work in 2005 called Flashlight, and it was his utopian proposal for people power. So you would sit in these chairs and push the pedals, and everyone's got a little light under the sun would light up, and solar panels attached to these poles made the disco ball spin. And he had he's always been an archivist, you know that. So he had references to funk culture, which was all about inclusivity here. So then we had Jennifer Marmon and Daniel Borens do a wonderful work called In Situ, where they approximated a real-life park bench and put a real-life tri-part billboard that had several iterations. And as it moved, it's really oscillated, but it had three different modernist paintings. I'm not going to do this justice, modern painting configurations. So they really wanted you to become part of the work, hence the double title. It was In Sit You, Y-O-U. So the double reading of, in situ as a place that we know as an urban constructed word, or as a physical in situ. I did want to tell you that after 25 years, we did a public consultation for the best work of the last 25 years. We had a vote, and people said, what was the most memorable? And although 10 of them rose to the surface immediately, 2 were outstanding, and it was a tie. And it was a tie between James Carl and Louis Jacob. And it's really significant to know that after the 25 years, the 2 that really rose to the top were the ones that had a public participation component in them. Social commentary. I'm just going to, I don't have time to do this. Yeah, so
I think that we really have to wrap it up.
Yeah, I'm just going to flip through them. So we've got Kim Adams and Bernie Miller and Liz Magor's stunning messengers with a Unabomber cabin, and of course Instant Coffee, where they imagined a fallout shelter, and you could watch a video of them eating and drinking and keeping safe in this very glitzy fallout shelter. With you could hear the sound of the boombox of the playful current, and that's it.
Great, thank you.
Thank you, Reena, for that wonderful walk through the history of the Toronto Sculpture Garden. I know there's so much more that is encompassed in a project of that length and number of years than you can kind of do justice to, but I think it was really instructive to have those images and to be able to kind of go through those projects with you. So just quickly, I know we're short on time with this session, but Jan and I are both going to just give very sort of brief responses or comments, and then we'll have some questions for Reena. So if you have questions from the audience, now is a great time to write them in the Q&A or write them in the chat.
Sorry, I just want to sorry to cut you, Jane, and because we're running out of time, and we won't be able to answer any public question at this moment. So we will coordinate with Reena, and we will answer them through emails and post it online after the session, because we really have to wrap it very soon, like in minutes.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Yeah, and then move on to the next session. Otherwise, we're really running out of time. I'm really sorry about the Q&A part.
Do you want to just throw? Do you want to just throw to the first question then? Should we just have a discussion amongst the three of us?
Sure. I mean, like we have a couple of minutes, and then we really have to move on. And I guess I would just have a quick questions, and because all these works are commissioned, the site specific, and when we were working on the master plan with the city, and we're also curious about and how to support the future of this work. So what happened to them after they're showing the garden?
Oh, we only funded them. They were the property of the artist, and we facilitated any sales, and there were sales. Brian Scott, Kim Adams, Peter Boyer, Dimitri Kaminker, Pierre Grange, Elaine Sandler, Tom Dean, to name a few. But we got the interested party in contact with the artist, and then we walked away. The only thing we asked of the artists was that if they ever discuss the work or use print material, images from it, that the Toronto Sculpture Garden get credited. There was no, they owned the work 100%, and they always had copyright.
If we have time, I'd like to just pose a question, kind of following up on public engagement, because I know you were sort of ended by talking about the projects that kind of had the most maybe visible public engagement. And I'm curious how much, you know, how you're thinking on that developed or grew from the initial projects, because it does seem like that was a trajectory from how the site was initially kind of transformed. And I'm curious just to hear sort of you speak a little bit more. That seems like a very important aspect of what temporary public art, I think, can do and can offer.
Actually, I could have started with the sequence of the sections was not deliberate. You know, I started off with the site as it was and moved away from it. But it was really an aspect of how the artist wanted to respond. And as that social programming component came from the artists themselves, we didn't require it or prescribe it. And I think that over time, because it had such a history and the artists were aware of it, they were always pushing boundaries to see how differently they could engage. And they all each brought their own interests to the site. And when we, as a board of about 8 people, this volunteer board, would look at it, we would be aware of the history of what we had shown before, and we didn't want to repeat ourselves. So we were always looking for new ways to engage the site. So we usually get 50 applications 3 times a year, and we just kept we just kept it fresh that way. It wasn't a prescribed requirement.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Well, thanks for the wonderful presentation. And really, it's one of my favorite places and to think of in Toronto. And thanks, Jane, and for a very brief discussion. Sorry, we're running out of time, and I really wish we can talk more about it. And for those who have questions, and for Reena, and for Sculpture Gardens, and please send in the Q&A box, and we will coordinate with Reena and answer them afterwards. Okay. And now I will pass it to Rebecca and to our second session.
Okay, thanks, Reena, so much for your work over the years and for sharing it with our audience. Thank you, Jane and Yan, for your conversation in that part of the session. For our next part of our session today, we're going to dive a little deeper into this landscape of temporary public art programming in Toronto today and looking forward. In my intro, I noted platforms curated by our next panelists all came on stream around 2015. Please correct me if I have those dates wrong. This is just from my own recollection. And all through the initiative of groups of citizens seeking this kind of public art experience, which I think is a really interesting way to begin. In our conversation following presentations and in recognizing that these platforms have been initiated by citizens, that is, by future would-be audiences of such a program, I'd like to talk about how this relates to site specificity, as this is something that each of these programs has responded to. And in this way, these more recently established programs have conceptual connections to the Toronto Sculpture Garden setup and program. But before we go into this section, I'd like to acknowledge an extremely strong recurring temporary public art program that I overlooked in my intro as I focused my thinking on sculpture and site. And that is the Scotiabank Contact Photography Festival. Since 2005, Contact and its artistic director, Bonnie Rubenstein, have been working with a strong network of partners, some of whom are included in our next round of speakers, across the entire city as site, using existing urban infrastructure to install close to 200 temporary photo-based works throughout their annual Festival of International Photography. So different thinking in terms of medium, site, temporality, and implementation strategies than we're discussing here today, but a really important part of Toronto's temporary public art landscape and not one that I wanted to overlook. Before we have presentations from each of our panelists, I'm going to introduce all of them. So here's the part where I'm going to run out of breath again, as I did earlier in the session. We're going to follow the alphabet here and start with Elena Altman. So please welcome our first panelist, Elena. Elena Altman is a cultural planner and designer who has a background in art and architecture. In her role as co-executive director at the Bentwood, she works with the local and artistic community to implement innovative and engaging programming, revealing new possibilities for public space and public art. Tyrone Bastian is an independent curator. He co-curated the inaugural Toronto Biennial of Art in 2019 and is working on the second edition scheduled for fall 2021. In 2018, he was one of the curators in Nuit Blanche Toronto, and from 2011 to 2016, he worked with Manassa-based arts, developing commissioned projects in Dubai, Abu Dhabi, Dhaka, Venice, and London. From 2005 to 2010, he was a curator for the first 3 editions of Performa in New York, and this semester he is also an adjunct professor at OCAD-U. And then finally, following up with C, Kari Spanar is an independent curator and writer living in Toronto. From 2015 to 2020, she curated a program of temporary site-responsive public art projects in Toronto's Don River Valley through the nonprofit Evergreen, where she's now a senior curatorial advisor. Spanar studied art history at Queen's University and Carleton University and participated in the 2012 to 2013 DAPL curatorial program in Amsterdam. Between 2014 and 2019, she contributed to the editorial team of C Magazine as assistant editor, and editorial director. So without further ado, I would like to turn it over to Elena Altman to begin our lightning round review of these 3 magnificent temporary art programming platforms in Toronto. Elena.
Thanks very much, Rebecca. I'm going to strive to go as quickly as possible, and so I'm going to start talking as I bring up my slides. My name is Elena Allman. I am one of the co-executive directors at the Bentwood Conservancy. And for those of you who are not familiar with the Bentwood, we are a new public space and programming platform located underneath the Gardner Expressway at Toronto's West End. We first opened to visitors in 2018, and since then have been an all-season hub for creative practice, public art, recreation, and connected urban life. Our site is layered with history as the former shoreline of the city of Toronto, a junction for trade, an important gathering place for Indigenous nations, as well as a strong military history as we straddle the frontage of Fort York National Historic Site. But given the time allowed, I want to focus on our relationships to the Gardner Expressway, the elevated highway, which really gave birth to the Bentway, and to which our platform is intimately tied. The Gardner was a structure that was built in the 60s. It is very representative of its time, car-centric, monumental, single-purposed in nature, and a structure that definitely privileged certain ways of living, certain communities over others. It's also been one of the most divisive and debated structures in the city of Toronto. For as long as I can remember, there has been endless debates about that have been quite singular in terms of whether the structure should stay or whether it should go. And the Bentway was really premised on changing the nature of that conversation. Instead of asking about choosing between these two poles, we asked whether a space that has long divided us could become a point of reconnection. Whether we could start to think about our cities as we densify in a hybrid way, so that the space would prioritize what was happening below in the same way as what was happening above. And it has been and continues to be a grand experiment. As I mentioned, we opened just 3 short years ago in 2018, and have welcomed hundreds of thousands of people to the space ever since for educational programming, recreational programming, and cultural programming. It has been really important for us right from the beginning that our programming, our public art, is an extension of the mandate of the BUILT project. All of the projects that we support are aimed at advancing conversations about urbanism and about public space. And so we don't see them as simply animation of the site. We don't see it as an act of beautification, but much more about broadening the conversation about what is possible in the city of Toronto. We work with artists in many different ways, co-commissioning or commissioning and co-commissioning temporary public art projects that lead to group exhibitions, like the If But What If exhibition in 2018, which featured wonderful multimedia projects by Saint-Vincent, Nazamani Mazanani, and Wally Dion, amongst others. We also have supported ephemeral and very immersive shared experiences, like our presentation of The Museum of the Moon by Luke Jerram, which was complemented by a whole suite of programs, including lunar stories, light meditations, and musical performance over its 6-day run, as well as more performance-based projects like this unbelievable co-created project by Naomi LaFrance, which involved 60 performers and an audience that roamed our site from end to end. Knowing the time allowed, I won't go into detail about the other ways in which we work, but all to say that in this moment during COVID, we, like many of our other collaborators and peers, have been taking a step back, really reflecting on what it is that we do and what we feel we need to do going forward. And I think one of the things that has emerged for us is that we really believe that public space is not a nice to have. It's an essential service that should be accessible to all Torontonians. And that within those spaces, it is absolutely critical that artists' voices remain relevant, not as simply voices of critique, but as voices to drive forward the way that our city will emerge from this pandemic. And so it is with that lens that we are thinking about the nature of public art moving forward. And I'll leave it at that.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Elena. What a great note to wrap up on. We're going to hand over to Tyrone Bastian now to go through Toronto Biennials Arts program, and then Kari. Thanks, Tyrone.
Sorry, I'm unmuted now. Hello, and thank you, Rebecca. Thank you, Jan, for the invitation. And thank you and hello to all of my co-speakers. I'm here to talk about the Toronto Biennial, and Rebecca was right. We started in about 2015, and it was citizen-led. It was started by a group of Torontonians who were seeing the need for Toronto to step out of the shadow of some of the bigger cities around it, to have its own biennial to promote Canadian artists and also to bring international artists here. Of course, we came about at a time when biennials are everywhere. There is a kind of a biennial exhaustion, that many would say. But at the same time, this came about at a time when Toronto is really needing a kind of new venue and a new structure, a new addition to the ecosystem that already exists. And so when I was brought on, one of the first things that was given to me and my co-curator was what was called the Indigenous Context Brief. And this was a document created by a Mohawk musician, artist, scholar named Ange Loft. And it was a really, really important document that provided, over 1,000 years of history, of Indigenous history of the land along the waterfront. And these were the areas that we wanted to bring to life, to activate, to engage with, and to invite artists to think about the kind of untold histories that we could share with Toronto audiences and international audiences more broadly. The sites varied from non-artist sites, non-art sites to sites that hadn't seen a lot of contemporary art within them. This building here is called the Small Arms Inspection Building. It's a former munitions factory that sits near Etobicoke Creek. This is a piece by Adrian Blackwell that is in direct reference to the creek that sat inside of it and became a kind of hub for performances and activities. This was our furthest westernmost point. I'm going to show you a shot of our furthest easternmost point, which sat in the Portlands. This is a former car dealership that was disused, had been closed up with a lot of water damage. Waterfront Toronto, which owns the site, became a partner and basically gave us this site to use. It was over 40,000 square feet of space. And so just really thinking about the ways in which temporary projects, exhibitions, public art can rethink about the use of these buildings, of which there are many in Toronto, and where else would you get 40,000 square feet of exhibition space? It was tricky. It was not an easy space to work with, but it was really inspirational for many of the artists who created new projects within. This is another piece by Adrian Blackwell, a kind of sister piece to the other. We had over 40 artists in the exhibition, over 160 artists all told with programs included, and we had 29 commissions. So we really do see ourselves as a commissioning biennial. We want to work with artists to create new work, and we share with all of them this Indigenous context brief. And so it really becomes the a kind of touchstone for everybody who's working on this project. This is a project by Curtis Tawas Santiago, which is a new work for him. He hadn't worked at this scale before, so we really wanted, or I really wanted to give Curtis an opportunity to think beyond the scale of his usual jewel boxes. And this was a piece done in a disused lot, or sort of a parking lot near Cherry Beach, using the stones or using the rocks from the surrounding area, from the spit and from the city, to create his own what he called the Jouvert Temple, which was inspired by his memories of Trinidad and the kinds of buildings he saw there, mixed with his reference points based on his recent travels and recent points of home in places like Portugal and so on. I also want to talk about other ways in which we worked with the city. We had over 14 sites across the city that we activated. Every 2 years with every biennial, we will be working with different sites, although some sites we will return to, largely because they're based upon really solid partnerships, collaborations. This is, as we've seen with this great presentation that started the talk, the Sculpture Garden. This was a piece by Lou Shepard. This came about through a collaboration with Sculpture Garden folks, and was an opportunity to work with an artist who hadn't yet worked, had not yet done a kind of a public art piece at this scale in Toronto. And so this was a fantastic way to work with Lou. This was a piece called Dawn Chorus Evensong. I won't get into the details of it. And we also worked with the Bentway and Alana. We also worked with Kari at Evergreen, but I just wanted to end with this to talk about also the ways in which live programming is a central part of the biennial, the ways in which we work with various communities, both here and afar. This was a piece by Embassy of Imagination that actually pulled in a number of their own network. So they were working, of course, with the youth of Kingate in Nunavut, and we brought 10 of them down to sort of lead this parade or this procession down the waterway from the Bentway to our site in the Portlands, and also with Oasis Skateboard Factory, which is a local group of youth that are taught how to make skateboards as a part of their finishing their high school education. In any case, I won't get too further into this because I know we're short on time, but we can talk a bit more about these projects in the Q&A. And I'll pass it on now to How do I stop sharing screen?
Thanks so much, Tyrone. That's amazing. It was really nice to think about also seeing some of those installation works that also had the smaller works installed inside the exhibition spaces as well, and that kind of giving artists the opportunity to work at different scales within the same program is really nice. We're going to go to Kari now. Kari, are you around? Ready to share? Here we go. Take it away.
I am here. Just going to make full screen. Okay, hi everyone. As Rebecca mentioned, my name is Kari Swinar, and for the past almost 6 years, I've been involved with the nonprofit Evergreen in Toronto, working on their public art program, which is centered around the Don River Valley. And that I wanted to start with this slide here, where you can see right down the middle of the map of Toronto is the Don Valley Watershed. So this is the landscape that I've been working in. It's one of the major watershed systems in the city of Toronto. This is the Evergreen site. So in 2014, Evergreen, which is an environmental nonprofit, began a partnership with the City of Toronto Parks Department and the Toronto Region Conservation Authority to funnel resources to the Don River Valley area, which is a watershed system that's been very neglected and polluted and overly industrialized over the past 200 years. But it's an area with really rich Indigenous, industrial, and ecological histories in the city of Toronto. So as part of this partnership, I was invited to develop a public art program. And this was a fantastic opportunity to develop a public art program from the beginning, from the ground up, and in a very, very interesting landscape. So here you have the overview of Evergreen, which is the nonprofit that operates out of the former brick factory in the Don Valley. I wanted to show a couple of images of the landscape. So here's the valley system with the DVP, the Don Valley Parkway, the trail system that runs through it, and seeing the connection to downtown Toronto. So in developing this public art program, we wanted to design a program that would allow artists to respond to the histories of the area, thinking of this not at all as a blank space or blank canvas, but as a valley system that has meant a lot of things to a lot of people with a very rich history. And so we designed a program that would involve commissioning 3 artists every year, and wanting to offer artists some strong curatorial and administrative support so that each artist could really develop projects for this site specifically, really understand the site and its histories to design their projects. There we go. There's the bottom of the Don River, where it's the most industrialized portion of the river. So really kind of varied landscape, which at some moments is quite natural, at other points very industrialized. And so, as I mentioned, we've done about 3 commissions per year since 2017, alongside workshops and talks that really try to engage people with the area and its histories. This is one of our first projects with Maria Hasabi, performance with Life of a Crabhead in 2017, a sculptural installation by Dwayne Linklater, a performance Walking Donkeys with Gareth Long in 2018, a text piece along the retaining wall by artist Will Kwan, a temporary sculptural installation using found industrial materials by Virginia Overton. I'm really flying through these. A mural by Beth Stewart. Wanted to show all these pieces to show, you know, the program is entirely temporary in nature, but temporary for us is up to 10 years. So some of the projects, like the performances, are very, very ephemeral, but others, like Dwayne Linklater's sculptures, will be on view for 10 years. So wanting to play with what temporary public art can mean, it can still have a long duration and a long engagement with the public. Here is a workshop with artist Susan Blight that took shape as a sort of walking tour around the valley, and a partnership that we did last year with the Toronto Biennial. for this piece with Maria Teresa Alves that was mapping the original route of the Don River before it was straightened. And I think that I will leave it there. I want to talk more about what temporary programming means to us, but I think we'll get there in the questions.
Thanks so much, Kari. Thanks so much, Kari. So we're going to bring everybody, well, no, we're going to bring Kari, Tyrone, and Alana back on. And we've got some time for, am I on? Yes. We've got some time for questions. So we've heard through Reena's presentation, we heard a lot, and some of those this lightning round presentations, we've heard about the opportunities for artists to expand scale, et cetera, in these kinds of temporary programs. But given the triangle of agents that bring public artwork to life, that is artists, audiences, and commissioning bodies, and all three of these sort of are represented in the audience for this summit, I'd like to hear each of your thoughts on the opportunities that are afforded audiences and even commissioning bodies within temporary programming platforms. What are the audience opportunities or commissioning opportunities within temporary programming platforms that perhaps don't exist in permanent programs? Who wants to go first? Tyrone? Can anybody hear me?
I can kick things off if you'd like. Okay.
Sorry, we were having tech issues earlier where nobody could hear me, so suddenly I thought maybe you weren't hearing me.
No, but I think
right
my sound keeps coming in and out. I didn't hear that full question. Sorry.
Elena, did you hear it?
Yeah, I think that you're asking about the opportunities that are afforded to audiences and commissioning bodies as a result of working towards temporary works rather than permanent works. And I mean, I can say for us that we really believe, you know, the Bentwood was a project that was founded on a desire to make connections. How can a site that is an artery that is, you know, connecting vehicles across the city do the same thing for people below? And you know, that's taken a physical form in our site. There's a trail that quite literally makes connections across it and to other neighborhoods. But we have really genuinely seen the power of the public art that we support and the programs that we support in connecting communities in a very different way. The creation of these kind of, you know, very direct, very ephemeral communities that form in relationship to a project is something that I don't think happens with permanent art in the same way, because there's a certain urgency associated with the temporary work that gathers people together with an intensity, with an intent for what might be a limited time, but I think it can be a very impactful and very memorable time. And from a commissioning standpoint, I think it's in the interest of working with those communities, developing relationships with those communities. That's why we do the work that we do. And I think, you know, our greatest challenge in being a site that supports temporary artwork is how we form these relationships, we develop, you know, strong communications and commitments to certain communities. And when the work goes away, how do we ensure that those relationships sustain beyond the work itself? And that's something that we challenge ourselves to answer, you know, every day.
Yeah, I think I think that all of that is true about relationship building and kind of legacies of dialogue and things like that are all ongoing benefits of this kind of programming. Kari or Tyrone, do either of you want to speak to this question?
Yeah, sure. I mean, to me, thinking about audience, I don't think that many or most people will see themselves represented in official permanent public artworks. I think we've seen that this year as conversations have been kind of exploding all over the world about the failings of monuments to official histories. And to me, temporary programming has a real opportunity to fill that gap and to address that, where, you know, I really do believe that you know, a city full of temporary activations that audience members will find many more moments of artworks that resonate with them. And I would love to explore that possibility more.
Do you think that permanent projects can have a temporary dimension kind of within them or tied to them? And how might temporary projects bring about permanent change? Kari, we'll start with you.
Yeah, I mean, I think practically there are many ways that permanent projects can have that temporary dimension, that spontaneity and responsiveness. But when I think about permanent change, I mean, I think about really the value systems that are behind permanent public art versus the value systems of temporary public art. And, you know, I guess I keep coming back to how we decided that public art has to be permanent in the first place, you know, how that value system was even established. You know, thinking that permanence in relation to culture is a very colonial mindset. And so I, you know, really think that following the values of temporary programming or allowing for that can create a bigger change around how we see culture and public in general. Yeah, maybe I'll leave it there.
Tyrone, did you want to speak?
Yeah,
to this?
I mean, I have an issue, same as Kari, with this idea of the word permanence, right? I think it is a colonial idea, but I do think about temporary projects affecting, you know, significant change. I think of two things. One, I think of projects with a political edge, right? Art that has a political element that sparks or influences a public discourse that eventually leads to change. And so for that, you know, I think of Kari's project, actually, By Life of a Craphead, which, you know, was happening just as I was arriving to Toronto. And I feel like that influenced a conversation here about bringing down colonial statues. And I think it's, you know, through images, it's actually resonated even more broadly within this discourse around bringing down these monuments to colonialism. So I think these works can have a major impact. Now, whether that brings about permanent change, I don't know, but I do think it's one step towards change. And for me, it's also images of Dago paint splashed onto colonial statues. We commissioned New Red Order to do a project for the biennial called Never Settle. And part of that work was video of sculptures with the paint splashed on them. And I feel like this, although not necessarily done by artists, but done by political action groups, you know, I think these images have a power that resonates, that actually can change and influence the conversation.
Mm-hmm. Elena, did you want to say anything about this? I think you kind of ended on a bold statement that I loved about public space being an essential service. So if you think about, therefore, public, you know, artists working in public being essential workers, it's kind of an interesting way of thinking about how we deal with things. But did you want to speak to this particular question?
I mean, mostly to say that I very much agree with what Kari and Tyrone said. I have tried to stop using this dichotomy between permanence and temporary work and think more about durational work. And, you know, to Kari's point before, allowing work to determine its own duration. Sometimes a work is, you know, its duration is a day, sometimes it's 10 years. And one of the things that we've been thinking about, and quite honestly, haven't been thinking about enough since the pandemic, is, you know, being conscious of the fact that you have to consider a work's full life cycle right from the beginning. The last thing we want to do as artists and practitioners supporting temporary work is to create waste. And I think that encouraging artists to think about their projects, their afterlife, how they'll grow, where they'll go, and not necessarily like a fixation on the object itself, but on the work's life cycle and its impact. And I think that that's important for everybody to come back to. I know that there are real challenges right now in presenting work, period, but I think it's an important consideration to come back to in the coming years.
So I think you raise a point. I'm just going to deviate from our questions for a second and grab one from from the audience, just because it relates very much to what you've just mentioned, which is, have any ephemeral projects become permanent? And if yes, how do you deal with materiality or fabrication? So is there any, I mean, you've been programming fairly, new programs, so I don't know whether this has come up in terms of something that decides to stay and how you kind of deal with that in terms of the viability of the work and commitments that were previously kind of understood between artist and commissioner. There might have been some of that, Kari, with Dwayne's project, because it's certainly long-term. Do you want to speak to that question?
Yeah, I can sort of speak to that question, although I haven't fully experienced that. As you say, Rebecca, it's still a very young program. So, and since we're considering temporary in the Don Valley is up to 10 years, still within that window. But Dwayne's project, yeah, I mean, we're trying to leave it open with Dwayne's project. I mean, there is this idea that, in 5 more years, when the project reaches its 10-year stage, maybe we would try to work with the city to see it stay more permanently. Although, as the person who asked the question states, I mean, the materiality of the sculptures and their condition will really dictate whether that's possible or not. I think that, there's a reason that permanent statues or permanent public artworks often look like steel and bronze statues. You really do have to choose that materiality that can allow them to be permanent, which hasn't really been the way that I've been working in the Don Valley. So I'm not really sure that many of the projects that I've had a hand in will be able to be permanent. But maybe I'm not sure if Tyrone or Alana have thoughts on that.
I know Tyrone is having sound issues, but I wonder whether the Biennial thinks about this at all. I know Sculpture Munster, which is this kind of every 10-year program, has developed over the past 50 years this legacy of pieces that have stayed behind over the kind of downtown area of Munster, which is a really nice sort of residue that stayed. But has the Biennial had any sort of thoughts around leaving some commissioning things that will stay beyond, that just the window of the festival kind of event?
Yeah, we've definitely been we've definitely been open to the conversation. I think we kind of leave it to people approaching us if they want to see something stay permanent. I don't think we're just not in the business of knowing where permanent work would make sense. But for instance, the Adrian Blackwell piece that I showed in my presentation, the one at 259 Lakeshore, the kind of the wooden seating arrangement, that's I didn't explain it, but it's built in the shape of Toronto Harbor. That piece, we had several people who wanted to, after the Biennial, bring it into a schoolyard and kind of turn it into a kind of a place for kids to play. Somebody else wanted to bring it to a university and have it being a place of study within a kind of student building. But none of that materialized. We, of course, were very happy to facilitate if people wanted it. But we were very, very realistic about the fact that these objects, these sculptures were not built necessarily, as Kari said, to withstand, the test of time, or to last beyond the 2.5 months of the Biennial. So it really is a piecemeal endeavor. That being said, I think that as we become more embedded within the Toronto ecosystem, I think, and I won't be around, but I'll be around for the next edition, and I know that we're already having a bit more conversation with the city, at least, about what projects might be of interest to them for the city to take on, because of course it's an extremely expensive endeavor for a city to take on a public art sculpture, and really they would be one of the few bodies that could actually manage something like that.
One thing that does come to mind is, and Reena mentioned briefly in her presentation, the 2 Marc de Souveraud works that were commissioned as part of an international sculpture symposium in 1967. Not necessarily commissioned as temporary works at all, but commissioned without any sort of operational support to maintain those works, and they followed quite a quite a story as they kind of fell into disrepair in the woods in High Park and were ultimately restored. But yeah, definitely interesting to think about what that time frame is right from the beginning of putting these programs into place. So you all curate temporary programs for specific sites, or in Tyrone's case, it's sort of a specific physical, historical, contextual geography. Last week, our session was about site specificity. Would you like to speak at all to the role that site specificity plays in your programming, either as a constraint or challenge, or an opportunity for artists to respond to? And by site, it doesn't necessarily need to be physical site. It could be, I think, temporal site as well, in terms of thinking about, one of you mentioned the kind of ability to have an urgency and timeliness to temporary programming.
I'm happy to start us off, because it's something I've been thinking about quite a bit recently, because we've been doing a lot more offsite programming of late. It has felt limiting to try to create destination programming, and so in an effort to try to kind of reaffirm a commitment to the public realm, we've been doing more work elsewhere. And so I've been visiting sites for the first time, and I think with artists and kind of remembering how important it is to come to a site without biases, and to truly allow for that exploration period to take place. I have to admit that I've become, I think that the relationship between a work and the site is critical, but I've become very wary of the term site specific, just because I see it adopted almost, verbatim in public art policy and used in a way that I think ends up creating sameness. It almost gets interpreted as, how can I reflect the site back to itself, rather than how can I critique it, how can I interpret it, how can I find something new. And so we've started using the term generative. Like, how does our site encourage people to advance their practice? How does it prompt people to think in new ways? How do we get to see the site anew through that work? This is a bit of semantics, but I do think it's important not to default to site specific as a way to kind of codify public art practice, and in its original intention, just ensure that that works were contextual in a way that challenged the status quo.
I'm gonna grab a couple of questions from the audience, because I am aware of the fact that we are running out of time and there's a lot of interesting chatter in the chat. One of the questions, and maybe this is, maybe we will start with Elena, just because it's about an infrastructure question. Can durational public art help create more permanent public space infrastructure, i.e. more trails along the Don River? Okay, Kari might want to speak to this as well. Or extensions of the Bentway programming further along the Gardner. Do you think the public art can actually become kind of almost like a way of advocating for more of these kinds of spaces?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's something that we're thinking about a lot in terms of our own growth, is how we begin with a programming strategy rather than leaping to an architectural proposition. We hosted a residency now about a year and a half ago, a sound-based residency on our site with and Mitchell Aikiyama and Brady Peters were the artists in residence, and they did a sound mapping of the site, which was absolutely phenomenal. Which has completely transformed the way that we're thinking about acoustics. And as we're starting to think about, what it means to transform future under Gardner environments, acoustic has kind of, become much more important in a way that we're thinking about the site. So sometimes I think it's an advocacy tool, and others I think it's really a learning tool that enables you to better think about investment and change.
Kari, did you want to speak to any sort of role that you think the art program might have had in advancing some of the broader advocacy work along the Don River Valley?
Yeah, I mean, I do think that the art program has played a role in creating more public awareness around the Don Valley, although I wouldn't want to give all of that credit to the art program because in the 5 years that the art program has been happening, it's coincided with the huge kind of growth of new condos and neighborhoods around the valley, just a huge population increase. So the valley has become more used and more paid attention to over these years anyway. In regard to whether the program can affect and play a role in permanent infrastructure is a really interesting question because we've specifically designed the program to be temporary with the goal of not leaving a permanent imprint on the ravine lands. So that was a big part of it, because it is public ravine lands, it's meant to be a kind of wild space in the center of the city. Working with temporary programming really fits within that so that nothing leaves a physical mark on the landscapes and leaving the landscape as it was. So I wouldn't really want the program to lead towards permanent trails and infrastructure being added, even though I know that that is happening alongside the program anyway.
So advancing appreciation of not necessarily actual foot traffic within.
Yeah, just trying to be conscientious of how, what role public art plays in altering a landscape and how that can be done sort of responsibly.
Yeah.
Maybe the goal isn't more permanent stuff down in the valley anyway.
I'm going to ask one. We are at time, but we started a little late, partially because of my own audio issues, I think. But so I'm going to ask one more question before wrapping up, and I'm going to ask this question of Tyrone just because I have read the Toronto Biennials' wonderful report out of the last out of your kind of inaugural event. And that might be a place to start with answering this question. So how do you gauge responsiveness and or awareness of the audience to temporary art in public spaces?
So like, how do we measure the success of a project in terms of its attendance or, yeah, I mean, it is a good question. I think that the biennial, what was so great about it for me personally was that we could work at very different scales. That because it is a kind of multi-armed project that takes place over 2.5 months, we had a really, really active program. I think that we were very aware that some of the things we would do would get big audiences and some things would not. And we were okay with the ones that did not. We had the Small Arms Inspection Building, which was one of the sites that I showed in the presentation. Although it had a program before we were there, it still wasn't or still isn't, a kind of well-known site that gets a lot of visitors. It's in Mississauga, so we knew that we weren't going to get a certain kind of Toronto audience that wasn't willing to kind of travel beyond the city. But we really wanted to get Mississauga audiences, but that is a hard nut to crack for someone who's not, for a team that's not from Mississauga necessarily. But we were really happy with, the 6 or 7 people that came, consistently to certain programs. We had some programs that had more than that, but there were talks and poetry readings and workshops that had smaller numbers, but we felt it was a really good start to building audience and building a kind of relationship with the site and with folks there. And we're going to return to that site for the next edition. And so we want to build on that. So we're very conscious of the kind of slow build that is needed, that most organizations have. If you have a space and you're programming regularly, you have that consistency to start building audiences. But as a biennial, you don't, right? You only have the 2.5 months that you're around, and then you switch up, and then you wait another two years. But then there were certain sites that we knew that we needed to really activate, like Union Station, that had hundreds of thousands of people go through every day. So we kind of wanted to be able to play both of those ends of the spectrum in terms of the kinds of audiences that we were expecting and looking to engage with. And of course, you attune the work based upon site. But yeah, I think in terms of the biennials, audience numbers, I think we were also very conscious of the fact that we wanted Toronto audiences to be our main concern, not necessarily international audiences, although that was a kind of secondary concern for us as well.
Amazing. Thank you, all three of you, for sharing this overview of your programs and your thoughts on the role of temporary public art programs and platforms within an urban context. In our conversation last week, we talked about the urban context as never being a fixed condition, but a constantly shifting and evolving landscape. And much of what we call public art still comes from the historic trajectory of monument, but over the past few years, as you've alluded to in your presentations and conversation, as we go through a collective reckoning with our historical monuments, particularly monuments to individuals and specific events, it's interesting to really think about our proclivities for permanence in public art, and Kari mentioned that as well. Is temporary or semi-permanent or durational perhaps the best temporality in a constantly changing world? And where does that put us in terms of collective memory and residual collective narratives that build up across cityscapes? And can these memories exist as archives of projects, legacies of dialogue, or other more ephemeral layers of shifting meaning within these softer tissues of a city public? That is, of course, the people. So thank you all for joining us. Before I hand over to Jan for final remarks, please mark your calendar for our last event, which is next week, December 8th. We're going back to 1:30 p.m. EST start time. Our final episode is session 9, The Digital Turn in Public Art, where we have Mark Boutin, John Isherwood from Bennington College, Vermont Digital Stone Project, and Ben Rubin, an artist, all in conversation about digital practices within public art, moderated by Mitchell Chen of Studio F-. I'm going to hand over to Jan now. Thank you all very much for joining us today. And I expect we have some questions that were not answered. It is usually my sole job to watch the Q&A and chat box, but I was kind of doing double duty today. So those questions will be answered, as always, in our follow-up newsletter. Jan?
Great. Well, thank you, everyone. And I really enjoyed the discussion today. And I think I really like the idea of not only to think about this dichotomy of public, temporary and permanent, but also how to think beyond it. And also how it finds its own interpretation and meaning and in different programs, responding to different sites and contexts. So thank you, everyone. And also thanks the audience for joining us today. Hope to see you again in our last session. And as mentioned, and all the session will be recorded and made available online on the Summit website, and the recording of all the previous sessions are available there right now. And everyone who signs up for our live sessions will also receive our bi-weekly newsletters, in which you will find all Summit related updates and a series of commissioned interviews conducted by art writer Rosemary Heather. And later today, we will launch the last in the series, a 3-part interview on the topic of public art in transit, featuring great conversations with London-based public art curator Marianne Safaikar and the Toronto-based public art consultants Biennials and Brad Golden. And please stay tuned. And I feel like both Rebecca and I are trying to rushing, and because we're running out of time constantly today. And that's it for today's session. And thank you and enjoy the rest of the day. See you next week at our last session. And goodbye, everyone.